When I saw George Floyd killed, I'm going to say something kind of disgusting. When I saw the George Floyd video, it wasn't even about George Floyd. It wasn't. I made that about me. The reason why I made that about me is because I've been assaulted by police officers. And because I've been assaulted by police officers and my homie have, and we've been handcuffed and stuff like that, we're connected to the experience of the one instance where it went too far. And so I think that there is something both intellectually and culturally that binds Black people to their experience here. And I think it's a mistake to ask them to discount it.
Well, just briefly, I'll say, I hear you with the call for representation, and certainly something I've heard a lot before. I mean, I think it's a challenge because I see so much representation, and I feel like I have all my life.
Well, we need more, Kmele. We need more.
The biggest television show growing up was The Cosby Show. It was Dr. Huxtable. Yeah. And I mean, I've always been surrounded by that. I've always had an expectation that I could be successful. And I think in a number of instances, it's worth acknowledging that, there are cohorts, like quote unquote Black cohorts in this country that tend to be exceptionally successful. Like, Nigerian, African, Caribbean, first generation immigrants. Like, that is the model minority, among the most successful minority groups in the country. It seems to me that there are lots of examples of that. But, we may agree to disagree on that. I think the point that you're raising about George Floyd is obviously one that resonates with a lot of people. When I, heard that story, I've done a lot of work on criminal justice reform issues and have covered a lot of those stories in different contexts, and honestly couldn't bring myself to watch the video for a long time because I've just, you get nightmares after a little while. You see enough of that stuff.
Trauma.
And anytime I hear George Floyd's name, I think about Kelly Thomas, that video. And I think I talked to you about that when we talked the last time. It was a mentally challenged man who the police were trying to take him into custody and effectively beat him to death while trying to take him into custody. And he went to the hospital and was, in critical condition. You watch this video and it's just this man screaming for his father, begging for help, and he dies. And when I see that and I see the George Floyd thing, I'm reminded of the work of Barbara Fields, who's a historian at Columbia, who wrote a book called Racecraft. And the main thrust of her book, if I can sort of take a whole book and try to reduce it to two sentences, is that race is created by racism. And when we use it, we end up having an impact on various other sort of attributes of the world and the framings of problems that we're talking about. And we can oftentimes create obstacles to building broader coalitions across broader communities of concern who have the same sort of issues because of these artificial boundaries that are created by race. And I think with criminal justice reform in particular, that's a place where we've created this perception of an issue that is unique and distinct to Black people, when in fact, there's a pretty broad population that's actually impacted by this, even if Blacks are overrepresented in some of those statistics. And it's also worth mentioning that, with things like over-policing, in the 1970s, late 1970s, into the early 80s, what people were mad about was under-policing. You had Charlie Rangel banging on about the death penalty for drug dealers because the white racists were letting drug dealers run wild in Black communities and sell poison to Black children and kill them. Mm-hmm. So there's been a seesaw, and in a sense, it's always possible to cast these things as racial issues. And it isn't untrue that there's a racial dynamic, but race isn't irreducible. There's always something underneath it because it is artificial. It necessarily is concealing a great many things. Even at the time of slavery, when Blacks were enslaved, it wasn't merely that Blacks were enslaved. There's an entire context in which something like that happens that leads to blacks being enslaved in particular, and understanding all of those dynamics is important for understanding that history, and understanding those dynamics in a contemporary setting is important, I think, for actually meaningfully addressing problems. I think it's detrimental when people say things in response to, deaths that are happening or criminal justice issues and say, well, it looks like there's a genocide on black men. It looks like it's open season on black men. They can't kill us all. And I'm not just pulling those phrases out of thin air. Like, prominent people have said those things in the context of discussing just the cases that we're talking about here.
So a couple of things. Number one, people definitely over the course of history have gotten things wrong, right? So there was certainly an overreaction in terms of the drug war and that's the only reason why I can sit here having voted for Joe Biden, right? People in history have made policy mistakes that have impacted communities all over. There have been things that have been done wrong. You come back and you say, hey, I voted wrong. This was wrong-headed. This had unintentional consequences. Maybe they were intentional. There's no way for me to know, but you say now they're unintentional. This is how I've learned, and I'll be a better public servant. So I'm sure that there was an overreaction to the Scarface era cocaine boom that was happening all over the place and how heroin hit the streets. And a lot of people made a lot of decisions about where these resources would go. They ended up creating a criminal class for other things that they may have not anticipated. So that's certainly true. I would say about race as it relates to slavery or the beginnings of black people here is, once again, even the term black itself is a very intentional term used to denote people who are of less human status that can continue to be harvested for slavery. So it's a very intentional word used in Europe to say, hey, we can continue to use black people for the purpose of slavery. So in its inception, the term black has always meant lower than. Okay. So when we talk about the experience of being black in America or being black here on this continent or in the West Indies or any other place, we're talking about a very specific structure that has always denoted that you were less than. And what we're asking is to reimagine and rediscuss being black in America as something that's inclusive, as something that means equal to. Now, this is a conversation that's been fluid. It was being had then, right? Because at the same time that the framers were putting together the documents that would make this country up, there were guys who in their later years, like Benjamin Franklin and other guys who were deriding slavery that entire time, even when people say, hey, it was just the times, there were people even then who realized that it was wrong. Okay. And so what you've seen is, over the course of years, institutions of white supremacy and institutions of American hypercapitalism try to continue to use this class warfare in order to have a society where white wealth and white privilege sit at the top of it and black people sit at the bottom of it. And that has been very intentionally done. So I keep saying that. So over the course of time, when you say black is not, it's not a casual thing. It's an active thing. It's always meant something. It's for, like, the term black is invented for the purposes of slavery and dehumanization, right? So it's always meant something, right? It's always meant something.
For otherizing, yeah.
For other, right? So for us now that black Americans have taken it upon themselves to define themselves for themselves and to speak about the culture, the history, and the state that we want to live in, right? Now that we have an idea and we have great thinkers like Kamel Foster, and we have all types of people like that, and we're self-definitive of who we are and what we want in this country. We don't want, at least the ones that I know, we don't want our blackness stripped from us because there was a price paid for it. What we want now is for that blackness to be respected enveloped and to a degree reconciled with. Like there have been other countries that have had these completely. Germany had a whole truth and reconciliation period because the country realized that they allowed themselves to be co-opted as a nation by some of the worst vile entities that have ever walked this planet. They realized that, and in order to be back up, to be readmitted to the world stage or a part of the world community, they forced themselves to look at themselves and to understand how people could go along with the deaths of 12 million people, and that's not even starting a world war, 20 million dead, all of that stuff like that, right? So for me, I think it's dangerous to not dangerous. It is dangerous. It's dangerous not to ask America to be active in not just the future, but in the present and in reconciling the past, because there's nobody who, this is the conundrum, Kmele, is there's no one who I speak to and who I talk to that doesn't want to be a part of it, that doesn't want to be, like, there's nobody who I know, well, maybe a couple people I know who would be upset if racism came to an end tomorrow. Maybe there are a couple of people that's getting money.
Who'd be what you said?
I said there's maybe a couple people I know who would be upset if racism ended tomorrow. There's a couple of people. There's a couple of people getting money. But the most people that I know, what they are struggling for is to be a part of it. They want to be a part of it. They want the equal protection. They want to feel like their hair, their history, their upward mobility, the way that they talk, the way that they dress, the things that are just intensely and inherently, almost uniquely American. They want to feel as if they belong to this entire thing, and they don't, and they're not making it up. And so what I'm thinking is, if America really is a community with all of us, why don't we help each other be a part of it?